Everybody, it's an absolute pleasure to see you all, as always, on our Friday morning sessions. So normally I talk to the AI roundtable, the EPRA AI roundtable, and Maria chairs the EMIL task force that has been in place for a number of years, and which is really a network of regulators and interested parties in our media literacy work. And the reason why we asked you to be here today and to join the two is because over the course of the delivery of the various meetings that we've had, we've noticed increasingly, I guess, the need and the interplay between what we talk about in the AI roundtable and what the EMIL network covers. And also because I really like working with Maria, so I thought it would be a good idea. No, joking aside, I just thought it would, we both thought that it would be a really good opportunity to explore those links a little bit more in depth and to ensure that all of our networks and all of our colleagues have an understanding, I suppose, and a sense of what that interplay looks like and what that can mean for them as regulators in their in the exercise of their duties, but also beyond our regulatory network, also our colleagues who are dealing a lot with media literacy, as we know, in the EMIL network, and how that dimension needs to be factored in. The fact that AI is very topical at the moment and is covered everywhere is an added dimension, but really these are discussions that we've been having for quite a while. So it's not, we're not falling to the current trends or the fashionable discourse. We definitely have explored those. So we have an absolutely stellar panel of speakers today, and we're very thankful to them for their time and their commitment to this meeting and to our networks more generally. Thank you very much for all of that. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to have a few presentations where we're going to talk about algorithm literacy, I should say, and we're going to explore that from a various perspectives, from a media and information literacy perspective, from an AI perspective, and also from a media perspective. And we're going to try and see how those different perspectives are actually quite aligned and need to work together. So we have, as I said, a stellar panel, and I'll introduce the members of the panel very shortly. And then after their presentation, we hope to have a discussions, and Maria and myself will moderate that discussion. So you'd be very, very welcome to ask questions. You can take the floor, or you can put questions in the chat, and Maria and myself will do our very best to put those questions to our panelists today. At the end of that, we might have a short session on current updates on either AI or MIL projects that you are, running or discovering or aligning or aware of. We always look forward to that sharing of information, as you know, in our meetings. And then at the end, Maria will come in and will try to, well, no, she won't try because she's a very talented person, so she will succeed. She will pull all that together for us and hopefully outline maybe a couple of further exploratory trends and threads that we might want to work on in the coming months and possibly years. So unless there's any questions at this stage, and you're all happy about that, it's me great pleasure to introduce Divina Frau-Meigs, who is a very I was going to say long-standing friend of EPRA and long-standing friend and ally of EPRA in our EMIL network. And it's always a pleasure to have you, Divina. And you're going to talk to us about algorithm literacy from a MIL perspective, and specifically you will present the Savoir Devenir crossover project. So Divina, I might hand the floor over to you at this stage.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for this introduction, and hello, everybody. I'm very happy to see familiar faces and be reassured that we are a strong network across Europe. It's always a pleasure. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can discuss on. Can you see, all of you? Yes, thank you for the invitation, and to Maria Donde as well for discussing this. Like you at Savoir, Devenir and in the media literacy community, we have been asking ourselves how to deal with the new evolutions and the fact that data are impacting media more and more. And so we're coming more and more to a kind of what I call a transliteracy, where we see how media, data, online documents, and overlap and help construct our current information world, information environment. So discussing with different sets of people, which I think is part of the equation, developers on the one hand, fact checkers, journalists, practitioners, teachers, librarians. We came up with this project crossover, in fact, originally driven by EU Disinfo Lab. Then we had to change partners a little bit because the developing side was a bit complicated, and we aligned with Check First, which is actually situated in Finland, though it has mostly French members, and Apache. So the project I'm going to show you is experimental. It's really because we were not satisfied with what we were finding in the field, and we thought we had to start making proposals. So it's really perfect that we are in this context of sharing experiences and testing things. Because when we did a sort of a quick analysis of the current state of algo literacy, we found that there was nothing much. Teachers were saying, we don't understand, we are not trained, algorithms and data, it's a black box, blah. Don't take us there without training. And actually, we're not specialists, we're not fact checkers, we're not journalists, and I suspect it's a lot of your constituency is in the same situation. Give us ready-made stuff. That modular, that we can then plug into our own activities, because this we know how to do. That kind of discussion came out, and Jordan Hill of OECD has also made a nice summary of all that. I leave you the PowerPoint so you'll have the references. The research also very tenuous, few experiments in classrooms and schools and among the other communities. Even the journalists were still on the data journalism. Algo journalism is not yet there, though it's moving very fast. Thank you, Ukraine. One of the challenges being that the industry tells us it's a black box. Even they don't know how their algorithms work, and this, of course, is a myth we have to debunk as media specialists, but it's there, it's very powerful in the imaginaries of people, and we can't go under that thing. And there are a few competency frameworks, and in media literacy in Europe, at least, we try to anchor the media literacy in competences. And some speak about algorithms, mostly they speak about data literacy. And so they lack focus. Okay, so that's where we were. And looking at the definitions of algo literacy, we found a few, and I'm underlining 3 here, which are coming either from the field of information literacy or computation or media literacy. And so one set of capabilities are okay, to apply algorithmic curation and control. Algorithmic literacy, modify predefined settings, that's the information computing people, changing algorithm outputs, great. You can imagine how journalists or practitioners or you and I can feel about that. And then Swart coming more from the media literacy field and saying, well, it's about the combination of users' awareness, knowledge, imaginaries, and tactics about algorithms. So probably the most akin to, I think, how we would be locating ourselves in terms of, okay, we're not developers, we're not the industry side of things, we are on the user's side of things, and what happens to the user is what matters to us. But what these definitions showed to us was that this idea of awareness of algorithms and how they work, of having to cope with them, adjusting behavior, etc. To us, these elements showed that algorithm education can be part of media and information literacy. We don't have to create a new literacy, you know, and start elaborating almost from scratch. There are a lot of things that we can take from our practices and add the algo literacy part from the user's perspective. So this is what I would like. My first message today is, for God's sake, let's not go to another separate literacy. It just happens that media and information literacy is a very composite set, and we have to just adjust the composite set. So when you look at the competences frameworks, same thing, the DigiComp 2.2, which in Europe nonetheless serves as our major reference framework, speaks about data. They've added data to information literacy and speak about information and data literacy, but it remains very much in the data realm, not the algorithmic realm for you to look at. It's already something, but again, we felt a bit frustrated. And so the project was about trying to be a bit more concrete about that, starting with users and what people do. And so some of you are a bit familiar already with the project. I'm now going to give results that we are compounding for the first time. So Crossover was born with this idea that we needed to measure the influence of algorithms. It was not necessarily a project to fight disinformation, but it was to see how algorithms pushed information to the users, and among that information, disinformation might or might not appear. And so we were really very much experimental and ready to be surprised, really, and we were. The reason we were happy as media literacy people to work in this project is that the developers were in the same mind as us about let's not focus on the black box. Let's not focus on the current debates on transparency, because it's not happening, and it's not happening fast enough compared to the use. And so the dashboard elaborated with Check First monitored APIs, the interface that is allowed for people to look at what's happening in the different platforms, but additionally developed home watchdogs, home computers, mini computers that were spread all around Belgium, and that allowed us to see what people were actually getting in terms of recommendations and rankings, etc. And there was mismatch between what Twitter and Google, etc., tells you, and that. And sometimes there wasn't. I'll give you a case where it doesn't happen. So we were interested in the mismatches, the matches, and the comparison across the country, because it helped us see what the users were doing. So the dashboard is actually very nice that way, and you can go on it if you want at crossover.social/dashboard. I won't do that because there's other speakers, but you can use the different keywords, hashtags, choose 7 or 8 platforms that we are covering, and figure out what is happening. And if you do it, typing Ukraine, you'll see that, for instance, one of the major things that are happening on Twitter and Odyssey and all that are about 20 types of videos that are, most of them, disinformation. But applying the dashboard and the fact that journalists were being trained to use the dashboard to make their investigations, etc., we were watching their interactions and interacting with them to see what we would do at the end the teacher, educator, user end, applying a EMIL practice, our guiding principles, that it has to be modular, based on authentic documents, competences, spirit of inquiry, and uses and practices, plus values. So we devised a work plan for the whole project, where we put our specifications, developed 4 scenarios of use that anybody, but including the journalists, would take in their everyday practices, analyze the results, produce 4 types of documents: the actual inquest, the article, the podcast, and the quizzes, and everything was regrouped in a pre-bunking kit. You see the thing? So that's how our logic worked. And at the initial level, we developed a kind of matrix based on those scenarios of use. And what are the scenarios of use is what you, me, or I, journalists would do, searching for by keywords, searching by communities, searching by trends, and searching with the dashboard, using the tool as an entry. But as usual with media literacy, the tool cannot be the only entry. And cannot be, we can't be in the tool competence bias. It has to be embedded in a larger project, like understanding information, understanding manipulation, etc., etc. But it's an option to enter by the tool. And actually the journalists, that's how they do it these days. They've changed their practice. They enter by the tool. From there, they decide, oh, this trend is interesting. They choose a theme and they do the inquiry. So one of the findings has been the practices are reversed when you have a tool. So something to take into account. And of course, we were trying to remain relatively basic in understanding, okay, ranking, recommendation. Recommendation we did 2 because it's the biggest part of use, and prediction, which is still budding and trying to put larger societal issues in face of it, and the EMIL competences. So you see how it's a EMIL framework. But that was the initial one. And then we decided that we would do it the modular way. So podcast, because people like to listen to things these days, the articles for investigation, quizzes as a knowledge base, but interactive so that they can be fun, and then provide also workshop plans for teachers. And we came up with our own competence framework, if you want, because the one from DigiComp was not precise enough, with elements that have to deal with communication, so media, the culture, the context of production, elements with information, search, control and management, and elements that have to do with data literacy in terms of resolution of problems and knowing how and to decipher and operationalize your use. So these 3 levels for us are key in being able to construct, if you want, a solid mastery. So the results, of course, our initial matrix had to change a little bit because we were dealing with authentic cases and not everything was coming the way we wanted or the moment we wanted. And so we had 2 of the podcasts and 2 of the scenarios of use that really were based on inquiry. And one of them is called Keyboard Fighters, and the other one is called Algorithms and Propaganda, Dangerous Liaisons, because we were looking at 2 real facts that were very present in Belgium. The Liberty Convoy idea that was going to be a major demonstration and blockade of Brussels, blah, 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 a la Canadian way, and the ban of RT Russia from all of Europe, which was interesting because then we told ourselves, oh, okay, propaganda is going to be out. The algorithms are now going to push solid BBC, whatever information, and they pushed Chinese state propaganda. So interesting to see that they have, some of our colleagues at Check First talked about addiction to the disinformation in a way. And of course, there are other reasons for that, but at least it was based on experience and search. And the two other ones were still, of course, based on inquiries and actual articles, but we added a layer of reflexivity. We asked the journalists to think about their practice using the dashboard and doing algo journalism. And we asked the developers to also share their practice about developing a tool in an agile way and taking into account the request of the developers, the EMIL experts, the journalists, etc., etc. And so work in progress if you want. And here we had an article that we called How Algorithms Changed My Work, which showed how the following communities of influencers, for instance, can be extremely revealing for journalists and makes them look at what is trending before making their choices. And the last one, which we call the algorithm watchers, in honor actually of the developers, because they did an amazing work and they're still continuing, of course, was about Google Autocomplete, where we showed that everywhere in the API and all over the households in Belgium, the algorithms were pushing Donbass Insider as the major keyword when you typed in Donbass if you wanted to know what was going on in Ukraine. And Donbass Insider is a major disinformation paper and website produced in pro-Russia Donbass. Anyway, so really checking, confirming things, etc. So you get the feel for it. So very practical, and the podcast allowed us to take people, the listeners, but also teachers, etc., through how it's done, sort of, and this is how you could do it, learning by doing in a way. And so we produced workshop plans for the teachers. So you see, for instance, the first module has the podcast, the transcription in French, English, and sorry, Andy, I'm going to say it wrong, Flemish, the quizzes also, and the attendant articles. One of the problems we've had, and we haven't completely solved it, is that we had to produce documents in French and Flemish and in English. And sometimes it fell a little bit through the walls. But it's an interesting exercise to try also and transcribe it in 2 or 3 languages and cultures. So that's also for us as a community in Europe. So, but the point for us was to make as many types of documents accessible to people, because we don't know how they're going to enter. And so the quizzes were interactive. For instance, this is the first one. You could have boxes that you empty, etc. You had different maps and stuff you can go online and figure out. And then workshops, the materials for the teachers basically transcribed minute by minute the podcast, and then suggested interpretations and questions for debate. So manipulating for proposing discussions in a classroom, very sort of typical stuff, but made it available for teachers as such. This made us refine completely the competences approach we had. We still kept the cultural, the communication part, and the information part, and the operation part, but with many more concrete things to have. And of course, for teachers, it means that they could decide, oh, I'm going to take this example, and today I'm going to look at biases and browsing. You can't apply the whole thing, but you can make a choice of how to organize your session. For anybody else, actually, beyond the teaching, the same thing would apply. And we ended up discussing with the whole team and our teachers that joined us by that time to produce a kind of synthesis of our findings in a way that was mnemotechnic, if you want, and usable as a poster that you can print out, have at your library, or have on your keyboard or whatever, of about 10 points, each time suggesting also a solution type of reaction. So you can look at them. it conducted us, it brought us to the idea that we have to formulate a kind of theory of change with what is happening, because it's not enough to just say it's happening like this, like this. We have to pull back to see what is happening if we want to go towards effective change. And effective change for us, of course, was after you've analyzed, detected the things and interpreted the motivations, the impacts, the competences, what would you do? Where do you go in terms of as a user? And so we were saying there's two levels, in fact, in that theory of change, which is about reacting, not just coping, but managing your own way of expressing control. Individually, it's about resilience, clearly. It's about protecting oneself, controlling your browsing and your navigation and fending off manipulation. Collectively is about resistance. I mean, clearly there's a moment now where we have to call on policymakers. It cannot just be done with the platforms. And of course, by that time, ChatGPT and the whole thing about a moratorium and etc. hadn't happened, but clearly it was going in the same direction of this is something that is vast enough with a lot of implications for disinformation and therefore risks for democracy. And we have to pull back and think about it collectively. So to conclude, besides that conclusion, definitely algo literacy is part of EMIL, or can be part of EMIL. It can be developed, of course, in other fields like computation and all that. But for EMIL, there's ways of doing it via the user approach and the scenarios of use. We can refine the framework for competences, and we should continue refining on it because it helps the end users. Providing easy-to-use examples and sensible practices is what we're trying to do. And the next step for us is testing it more. And we've done it in very small pilot groups. And then, yes, still push for transparency. This black box can be open. It's really a myth by the industry. And Elon Musk opening or saying some of the Twitter algorithms showing them. It can be done, and then, but mostly, basically for us, use of algorithms and the transparency on use is what I would emphasize and maybe leave with us all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Divina. I made the capital sin when I introduced you. I didn't attribute your title. You are Professor Divina Frau-Meigs, and I don't want to be one of those people that don't quote women's titles and quote men's titles only. Goes against my equality, diversity, and inclusion credentials. So thank you very much for that. If you have questions for Divina, please put them in the chat now. Maria will collate them and we will try and ask them after. Stefan, I see your hand is up and I'm happy, but are you happy if we go with the presentation?
Oh, yes, sure. No, sure.
Thank
Wonderful.
You so much.
Excuse me.
Thank you so much. So this was a really interesting project. And as always with those initiatives, it leaves us with a lot of a to-do list in many ways, so those projects and those resources ask more questions than they solve in many ways, and that means the field is forever kind of moving and evolving, and that's really, really interesting. So we talked about algorithm literacy. I need to be able to say that properly. Algorithm literacy. From a EMIL perspective, I think I'd be really interested now to move on to Dr. Ansgar Koene, who, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, who will talk to us about algorithm literacy from an AI perspective. So just a very quick introduction on Ansgar. He is EY Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader. And really that is about helping organization navigating regulatory implication of artificial intelligence. So we thought he was particularly well placed to come and talk to us And we're going to focus, I think, on AI explainability. And here is a big word for this morning. So I hope you all have had your coffees. But I think, Ansgar, I'm going to give you the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for the invitation to speak to you today. So in my presentation, I will focus on just providing a kind of high-level understanding of where does the explainability issue actually arise from when it comes to AI. Why is it important to be able to provide appropriate kinds of explanation to people? And there are some activities already around helping generate more literacy around how AI operates. Unfortunately, I did not actually include the links in the current presentation, but I'd be happy to pursue those later on. So let me just share my screen. And let me share the correct screen. Good. So yes, first off, I think it's always good to start with a little bit of a clarification what we mean when we say AI. Really what we're saying when we say AI is that we're referring to quite a large class of different ways of automating things that, generally speaking, can be viewed as technologies that try to emulate in one way or another human cognitive functions. And I'm not actually that comfortable with that phrasing because it already imposes a kind of anthropomorphism, which is one of the problems when it comes to people's understanding around AI. Really what we're talking about is certain approaches like machine learning and neural networks kinds of approaches, and certain application areas such as natural language processing, computer vision, decision making, and those types of applications. And the types of outputs that these systems generate are actually sort of four types. One is that they predict numbers similar to what regression does, how many of something. They categorize, do grouping, and do outcome sort of anomaly detection types of things. In sort of prediction of what is likely to be. And the core of this is that as a general rule, statistics derived from input data is a key element that determines the kinds of outputs that they're performing. And that will also come back as one of the challenges when it comes to explaining the systems. Areas where they're being used in industries, things like customer interactions, chatbots, etc., analytics, decision making. Now, why is explainability important for AI? Well, at the core, if you don't understand what the system is doing, it's going to be very difficult to assess whether or not the system is reliable or what kind of vulnerabilities it has. And this is especially an issue because these systems are trained, they are not programmed by hand in a sense, which means actually the way in which the system comes to its outcome is not necessarily in the way that we as a human expect that it would be processing data to get to an outcome, which can lead to the system seeming to be very reliable when we test it in areas where we think that a human would have challenges with dealing with particular variations in the input, but it's actually very brittle in areas that we as a human expect that it would be solid because we as a human would not have a problem with it. So not understanding the underlying system makes it actually difficult to do the reliability assessment. Explainability is necessary in order to be able to challenge the validity of outcomes. We got an outcome from the system. I, as a subject who's subject to perhaps an organization that's using this as a decision-making system, it could be a recommender system in the social media space. If I have no idea how it got to this kind of outcome, how will I be able to say whether or not this outcome is appropriate to me? It performed well the last 90 times that it used it. The next outcome that it produced, it doesn't seem right to me, but since it was producing the right outcome for so many times, how do I know whether I should be challenging this outcome if I don't understand anything about how the system operates? We need explainability in order to assess the lawfulness of the processing. We need to be able to understand what kind of data actually got used here. For instance, in the case of large language models, we've now seen challenges to the system. Are you using copyrighted material? Are you actually infringing on things like copyright? Are you infringing on anti-discrimination rules because of the way you're processing data? If you don't have explainability about the underlying way the system process, it becomes much more difficult to assess whether or not any of these violations are happening. It is an important explainability, and this is something that's important for a lot of the citizens receiving outcomes on social media, etc., and other areas in communications where AI is being used. Explainability is important in order to properly interpret the outcomes. If you receive an outcome, for instance, ChatGPT creates a nice text that reads well, but I don't understand that fundamentally ChatGPT isn't about understanding context, it's about predicting probable next words in a sentence. If I don't have that kind of an understanding about how the system works, I don't know that I should be interpreting the text that it's giving me in a certain way, that I should not uncritically accept any claims to particular facts that it spews out. And so explainability is important for knowing, having a critical attitude to the kinds of outputs that you're receiving. And it is important for the ability to anticipate usage limitations. Underlying, where can you use it and where can you not use the kind of system appropriately? So where does the challenge around explainability actually arise from when it comes to AI systems? Especially with machine learning, we are often told these are black box models. We were just hearing in the previous talk, this is a grand claim that is being made without often a lot of underlying explanation as to where this claim comes from. A point that I haven't listed here because it's not specific to AI is sometimes the claim is just based on a business model that we don't want to tell you how the system operates. But so 5 or 6 of sort of the main drivers for why explainability in AI is challenging is, first of all, because of the complexity of the model size and the number of parameters are in there. We've seen actually this problem, for instance, with trying to explain how Google search algorithm operates before they started introducing machine learning into it, simply because they had actually been tweaking it and adding on bits and pieces with so many additional parameters that Google itself was having difficulties understanding how the system operated. And that was without so-called AI in there. It was simply the number of parameters present. And connected to that is AI systems tend to be complex and difficult to explain because we use them for tasks that are complicated. Why do we use machine learning to do computer vision? We use it because our previous attempts at doing computer vision with hand-coded things did not work very well. Vision is actually a complicated problem. We cannot really explain how a human does vision. And so asking that we are able to explain how the machine does vision, if it does good vision, is inherently difficult just because the task itself is a difficult thing. You're asking somebody to, in simple words, explain a complicated task. Then machine learning models, as I said, they're not explicitly programmed. They are inferred from the data, which we use the term learning for, in itself an anthropomorphic piece of language that makes people think that the system can do something that it can't. Learning implies more in understanding than data inference does. But just this fact that what you programmed was a general way of doing inference, and then you threw some data at it, that introduces some complexity when it comes to trying to explain what the final model is that actually got generated. Some systems involve stochastic steps in this learning process, which makes it, again, more complicated to say, why do you get this particular output? And the reason for introducing this kind of stochasticity is in order to avoid getting trapped in local optimizations and being able to get to more general kinds of optimizations. And in a similar way, some systems are run in a way that involves some stochastic steps in the generation of the output. You see that, for instance, also with ChatGPT and those kinds of systems. If you give it the same kind of prompt twice, you will not get the same output because it actually has some steps in there that are stochastic. But for explainability, that introduces a challenge because it means we cannot simply do input-output testing in an easy way if the output keeps changing for the same kind of input. And then finally, some systems, and that is by no means all of the AI systems that we're using, it's actually the minority of the ones that we're currently using, run in a continuously learning mode, which means that the way in which the system operates, the internal model actually changes over time. So your explanation at one time will no longer be true at another time. So those are some of the challenges that why explainability of AI can be difficult, and some of these are specific to AI. However, that doesn't mean that we need to just say, well, it's a black box, sorry, I can't tell you anything. The ICO a couple of years ago by now already put out a very nice guidance on explaining decisions made by artificial intelligence, which certainly at the high level, I would still very much point to as a good kind of guidance to give. And it identifies 6 sort of core direct dimensions of explainability. We need to accept that when we are doing explanation of a complicated system, the explanation is always inherently introducing a kind of simplification, and often the explanation will be a case that it explains a particular output. It doesn't explain all of the kinds of ways in which the system will behave. But that is an inherent issue with explanation, of course. A full, complete, detailed explanation would end up being just as complicated as the original system. But you can generally, people don't want a full explanation, but what they want is an explanation of a specific aspect. And so we can look at explaining the rationale behind the system. What are the core reasons that led to this decision? So for instance, identify what are the key input pieces of data that led to the output, which ones had the most weight leading to the output that was generated here. And there are various tools to help do this. Explaining the responsibility behind it. Often we might not actually be that interested in the technicalities of it, but we want to know which organization, which person, where do I go if I had a problem? Data explanation, clarify which data is actually being used here. Often this can be enough to be able to properly challenge an output, because you can identify, well, actually this data that you used as an input is not valid data. Maybe it's not even data that truly applies to me. You got me confused with somebody else. And so explaining the kind of data that got used, and we've seen that this was also sort of one of the bases for the current GDPR challenges on to OpenAI and the way that they've been functioning. Fairness explanations, that effectively you're just asking, can you show me statistics about how your system operates over certain different kinds of inputs to prove that your system is actually not having negative inputs to certain groups of people. Safety and performance explanations, which basically goes back to show me what are the tests and the safeguards that you've built around it. You don't really need to go into the details of the system. You need to tell me, how have you validated the system? How have you ensured reliability? And impact explanations. How are you actually using the outputs of the AI component in your larger system, and the way in which those are going to impact me? All of these things are kinds of explanations that can be generated for AI systems. They are not blocked by any of the previous kinds of challenges that I mentioned. One element that I think is an important one, and it goes to the sort of issue that I mentioned before around helping people understand how to interpret the kinds of outputs is the need to really push for better language in the way in which these systems are being described, and for the way in which they're being advertised. We need to demand that the descriptions around what this AI system is doing for you actually clearly specify the limitations that it has as well, and clarifies, for instance, that when a large language model is producing an output that is incorrect, calling this a hallucination is hugely misleading, because it implies that that was actually a case where the system somehow went off and did something different than usually, whereas in reality, when it was hallucinating, it was just doing the same thing as always, but the truth in this case didn't fit the overall pattern of statistical probability. And so in many ways, trying to fix the system by fixing something specific about hallucinations is never going to work, because it's actually the fact that the truth is that we don't all adhere to an average probable way of being, and that's something that these kinds of systems will never be able to capture. So that's a kind of high-level overview of why do we need explainability, where does explainability challenges come from for AI systems, and some of the ways in which we can actually produce explainability if we approach it from understanding that we have specific aspects that we want to explain and focus in on those aspects. And with that, I will hand over to the next speaker and hopefully leave enough time for questions.
Thank you so much, Ansgar. And while you were talking, I was scrambling notes about how I'm going to go back to some of my colleagues and tell them, look at this framework, how interesting this is. So thank you very much for that. Again, as with Divina, we will ask you to put your questions on the chat. We will have a discussion, so you'll have an opportunity to raise your hand as well at the end, but we wanted to get the presentations done first. So we've talked about algorithm literacy in a EMIL context. We've talked about it from an AI context. So let's talk about it from a media and law context now. And I'm going to ask Dr. Max van Drunen to take the floor. Max comes to us from the University of Amsterdam. He works with Natalie Helberger, who also a long-standing friend of EPRA and of our various task force. And Max, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you all for the invitation. It's been a super interesting event already. Let me share my screen and walk you all through sharing my screen, as is tradition. Okay, this should be visible now. So I am Max van Drunen. I'm a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam at the Institute for Information Law. Also working now quite a lot at the AI Media and Democracy Lab, an initiative that Natalie set up together with Claes de Vreese, basically collaborating with media scholars, communication scientists, media companies. And in that context, I work a lot on the way that media companies can assume editorial responsibility for the AI systems that they use, and how they can explain these systems to the audience, which is what I'll be talking about today. I'll cover three main topics. First, actually, how is AI being used by media companies and how does it impact editorial standards? Then the two most important parts, I'd argue, is how can media companies exercise editorial control over AI and how can they explain these systems to the audience? So let's start at the beginning of the editorial process. AI is increasingly being used actually to gather news, and that's not something entirely new. You might be familiar with Panama Papers, where AI systems were already used to sift through these millions and millions of documents and allow journalists to spot the interesting stories hiding in that data. More recent systems are becoming a little bit more advanced and doing more of the work of actually spotting these interesting stories. So one interesting example is angle kindling, which I think you'll have to agree with me is not a very appealing name, but the system itself is actually quite interesting. It basically sifts through the thousands of press releases that journalists receive constantly and then alerts them to, okay, these are the main points in this press release, and this is the angle with which you can cover them. Very concretely, it looks something like this, first summarizing, okay, this is the main point, and then these are some potential sources of controversy. The challenge from an editorial standards perspective, of course, is that this sort of steers journalistic attention. It alerts them to this is the specific part of the story that you should pay attention to. Or if we're talking about AI that's being used to sift through millions of documents, these are the stories that you should be paying attention to. And the implication of that is that certain stories perhaps are escaping journalistic attention. AI is also being used throughout all of the other parts of the editorial process, of course. Generative AI used to produce news, of course. Then we run into standards around libel, around disinformation. Probably one of the most egregious examples of this is something I covered 2 weeks ago by the New York Times, where they asked ChatGPT, okay, write a column from the point of view of Alex Jones. And ChatGPT, of course, expertly predicted all of the following words that would follow in such a column. Examples do not have to be as egregious as this to be problematic from a media law perspective. It's quite enough already that it simply falls short of the editorial standards of the media company that uses it, or if it has, as is sometimes called, a hallucination. And then finally, AI is being used and has been used for quite some years now, of course, to distribute news to recommender systems, which has implications for diversity when it makes sure that news users see only news that corresponds to their interests or don't see enough diverse news to get enough comprehensive view of all of the news that's out there. The common through line through these stories, I'd say, is that when AI is being used to take editorial decisions, it runs into exactly the same editorial values as journalists have been trying to safeguard now for the last 100 to 200 years. The problem there is that editors can't exercise editorial control over AI by themselves, even though they have the editorial expertise to know how these values should be negotiated. They don't have the technical expertise to build these AI systems. Quite often, they also simply don't have the funds, the resources, the data to be able to build these systems. So they rely on engineers, on product managers, on business departments to ultimately build an AI tool that is used to take editorial decisions. If there is collaboration, if editors are involved in that process, the form of that collaboration very much depends on the complexity of the technology. So you see with data journalism, something fairly simple, where the collaboration can quite often take place between one data journalist and one beat reporter. When we start to talk about more complex AI system, we're going to talk about collaboration between departments, between editorial departments, between engineering departments, between business departments. Media companies have increasingly started to formalize processes to make sure that that collaboration actually proceeds in a manner that makes sure editorial values are being incorporated in the AI systems that they use. So, for example, making sure that editors are involved somewhat early in the process, so they can actually have an influence on design, that are involved at the right level of seniority, and increasingly also that there are intermediaries that can actually guide the collaboration between all of these teams. When we're talking about explainability, as we're doing this morning, quite a bit of the key to effective exercise of editorial control over AI is transparency for the journalists and editors that use these AI systems and that are in charge of evaluating their impact on editorial values. That explainability or that transparency can take a number of different forms. First, of course, we can speak to specific explanations about a specific output of an AI system. So then if you think of the angle kindling system that we talked about a little bit earlier, the transparency is sort of built into the model to a certain extent. It says, okay, these are the sources of controversy, and then to the right, this is the part of the press release that leads the model to believe that there actually is a controversy. Those specific explanations, they allow you to evaluate the specific outputs. Should we be relying on this or not? And if not, perhaps we should do further research. What they usually do not allow you to do is to evaluate the overall impact of the system. So in this case, for example, it might be perfectly correct that changes to gentrification, as is the first potential source of controversy that it lists, that might be a perfectly correctly identified source of controversy. Nevertheless, if the model constantly points only to certain controversies and not others, specific explanations are not going to help to address that issue. For that, it's needed to have an insight into the overall function of the system. So, for example, auditing the training data or looking at rather the outputs of the system as a whole. And there, let me take a moment to shamelessly plug the work of a colleague of mine, Sanne Vrijenhoek, who built some metrics designed to test the extent to which the recommendations that recommender systems makes actually comports with different conceptualizations of diversity. This is what that might look like in practice. Looking firstly at several different types of recommender systems and not just random recommendations. And then looking to what extent all of these recommender systems promote, in this case, alternative voices to which users are not generally exposed. Both of these explanations are quite technical. I think it's also worth mentioning that in quite a lot of cases, the explanations simply travel via word of mouth. It's one journalist with technical expertise explaining to their colleagues, okay, this is how the system works, this is when you can rely on it, or on a more institutional level, media companies looking at each other and seeing, okay, apparently this system is being used by a lot of other media companies, presumably it's trustworthy. And that assumption, of course, can be tested and critiqued rather significantly. If we look forward to the challenges that might arise when the media is going to rely more on third-party AI tools, such as the one developed by OpenAI, one challenge I'd say is that simply can media still continue to influence the way that these third-party AI tools operate? Can this collaboration that media companies have so far had, mostly when they develop AI tools in-house, actually still work? Can editors still influence the editorial values of the AI tools that they use? That influence could be exercised to a certain extent when media so far used third-party technological systems. There was sort of a negotiation, okay, the system needs to be adapted in a certain way to make sure that the editorial values to be safeguarded can continue to be safeguarded. The key question there, however, is one of markets. If there is only one or two or three really significant AI companies out there that provide the tools that media companies can use, the media organizations first have very limited choice, and second, their negotiating power vis-a-vis these companies is going to be rather limited, which in turn means that their ability to influence editorial values and ask for adaptations is going to be limited as well. We saw a very similar dynamic play out in the platform context. And then the second challenge, if media cannot influence the way that these third-party AI tools operate, can they even know how the AI tools impact editorial values? And there, I think also it's useful to look back at the platform context and also a point that Ansgar made, which is very often the business case for being very transparent about the way that your AI systems might have a negative impact on certain editorial values is rather limited. In that context, we've also seen that platforms have been very, very closed off to actually sharing the data that's necessary to understand how their AI systems impact editorial values. Seen in recent years, a lot of legal push actually to force platforms to provide such data, either specifically to media companies. The DMA has this provision on sharing data on the advertising revenue with publishers, and of course makes a very small step into transparency towards media companies as well. The DSA has its provision on data access for vetted researchers. None of that seems to be particularly relevant to text companies such as OpenAI, So then the follow-up question is, can media decide not to use OpenAI? There is a worry among media companies of actually their ability to stop journalists from using publicly available tools such as ChatGPT, simply because journalists are under a lot of pressure. And media companies are not necessarily able to control the extent to which they use alternative model, of course, is simply to build your own, as Bloomberg has arguably done with its Bloomberg GPT. Again, not a very appealing name, but effectively using, in this case, I think GPT-3 and training it on your own huge set of data. That, however, is not necessarily an option for every media company, and particularly not for smaller or media companies. Okay, let me then take a rather hard turn to explaining AI to the audience. In terms of legal obligations, the focus very much is actually on disclosure, either disclosure of the AI system as a whole, or when specific AI-generated output is being shown to the audience. The approach that the GDPR takes with disclosure, the need to disclose the existence of automated decision-making profiling. The AI Act also has some provisions that move into that direction, particularly focused around deepfakes. When we go beyond this, there's of course the need to explain the functioning and the parameters of the system as a whole. You see this in the GDPR and the DSA provisional recommender systems, as well as the need to explain a specific decision. If we move to what we actually want, though, if the media is going to be using AI more, why should they, from a legal perspective, explain these tools to the audience? Two main goals feature quite heavily in that discussion. And the first is accountability. The traditional logic is that accountability to the audience is especially important in the context of the media, given the media's limited accountability to the states. And the second is trust. The media relies on trust, of course, to fulfill its democratic role. The question that is, how does AI impact the audience's trust in the media? And from a legal perspective, what kind of trust do we actually want the audience to have in the media? I think it's very important here to be quite precise because the term trust is used quite differently in the AI transparency literature and, for example, in the media literature. From a legal perspective, the question of when the audience can rely on the media to inform them, to do the things which they rely on the media to do, to provide them accurate news, comprehensive news, diverse news, is quite important. Sometimes you also see a conceptualization of trust that's simply acceptance of a specific recommendation. That I think is quite a bit less useful from a legal and normative perspective. Of course, the question to which explanations and forms of transparency are actually useful to increase trust in the media is very much a legal or an empirical question. So both legal and empirical perspectives are needed here. The good news there is that risk perceptions, for example, transparencies about the fairness, accuracy, accountability, and transparency of the system do influence trust in the media. Individuals also say that a wide variety of explanations are important to trust. So there we also see, for example, some of the explanations that Ansgar talked about, actually who's responsible for the system, what are its impacts, not only how does the system work and is the system being used, are important to individuals' trust in the media. However, when you look at actually in the nitty-gritty, to what extent do specific explanations impact trust in the media or in the specific message or recommendation that are being shown, that effects generally are quite limited and small. So there have been a lot of studies on the credibility of automatically generated news. Most of this, it should be noted, is from before ChatGPT really got into the public consciousness. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this changes. But in general, the outcome of those studies was that automatically generated news, when it's labeled, it has quite limited impact on the extent to which it's seen as more or less credible. Similarly, explanations about the way news recommenders function. So in that case, for example, what data they use. Do they recommend news based on your interest or based on your social demographic data? Has in this study no impact on trust. And I'll leave it there and open it back up to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Max. Very helpful. If a tad sobering in parts, we're kind of going, ooh, these issues of trusts are not going away, are they? Thanks very much for that. I know there is some activities in the chat function, but I also would like now to invite you to either take the floor or Maria maybe to come forward with some questions. We can either direct them to the to individual speakers, so either Divina, Ansgar or Max, or indeed more general topics where all three of them might want to input their various perspectives. So who wants to do the hardest thing in a panel discussion, and that is to ask the first question? Not everybody at once, please. Maria, will I turn to you for a question, maybe?
Sure. I'm just having a quick look just to make sure I can't see any hands up. I don't want to jump in before someone else. There were a couple of questions in the chat. Stefan has asked. I'll just go back to that if I may first, because I don't want to miss it. And I know he was looking for the floor earlier as well. But Stefan has asked about the links to the fact-checking community, I guess, and the fact-checking profession of the type of work that Divina was talking about. And I also was interested in this the use of and he quotes easy to use examples and sensible practices. Divina, I don't know if you want to well, so firstly, Stefan, I don't know if you want to come in and expand on that, or Divina, if you want to react to the question of how fact-checking relates to your work. I know you will have views on this.
Yeah, if I may, Divina, just to explain it, as you have said, the practical work of disinformation examples, of narratives spread, maybe even the monitoring of how maybe toxic algorithms are pushing disinformation on platforms could be. I was just wondering if you already cooperate with fact-checking organizations who do this work on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, I think cooperation is one of the key words you've said. And I think if there's something between the three of us, Max and Ansgar's presentations, is you can't go there alone and you can't improvise it. I mean, so once we agreed on that, then we can start work and base ourselves on the multi-stakeholder approach that we develop with media literacy often, which is not just a buzzword, but is something that I think is a very heartfelt and experienced approach. So I'll just share my screen for a minute, which I should have done earlier, if you don't mind. And
please do, and it might also answer the questions.
The dashboard, if I can. Hang on, this is all messy. Are you seeing my screen or not? Are you seeing the mess of my screen or not?
Yeah, we see your screen. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm on the dashboard, just to answer partly Patrick Varnier's question about how we go about it. It has two levels, the dashboard, going to the API, so the sort of things that Max and Ansgar have been talking about, directing the, but also the different locations where there are other users. And you can choose to see things through the point of view of a user, you know, in Brussels, et cetera, or the API. And then the language, of course, because we had two. Then the platform. I chose Odyssey just to show you just 3 days ago and what they were doing. For the moment, the users cannot put in their own keywords because it's journalists and we're still building the keyword base. But if you see that I choose nuclear, on Odyssey, which is a sort of the extreme right YouTube, as Hind, our journalist, calls it, you can see what the top 20 search results are, and how it's basically putting the onus of the nuclear situation on Zelensky. And so you can tell yourself as a journalist, and here I'm following Max and Ansgar's there, is changing the perspective of journalists, because journalists can decide, oh, hang on, this is what's trending, so I should explore this thing about Zelensky and the nuclear and things like that. And so the search via the tool can inform the agenda setting situation of a journalist, but also of any user, you know, me or a history teacher, whatever. So that's what's interesting about this. And if you go back then to on the website, if I can, per se, oops, sorry, I have to do this. You are going to have a lot of stories. And you were right, Stefan, that it's not enough to just have a dashboard, just as usual with the tool. You still need, and you will always need, the journalist or the expert or the educator, whatever, to give sense, to interpret the whole thing. And so you can see the latest stories and how they've been rewritten in a way by either EU Disinfo Lab and the fact checkers in Brussels, or Check First. And so you can go and look at, for instance, why is Nazi regularly trending on Twitter in Belgium and things like that. So you can really have cases, and they produce all their data. They give you the search results. They give you the methodology, which for us, you know, in terms of explainability, awareness, having ways of ensuring how the process has been done is very important, including for the teachers and for the educators and etc. So the findings is what you get, but the key, I think, has been, and we've discovered that with this information, that opening up our processes, not just opening up AI, but opening up how journalists work, how fact checkers work, how educators work. And what I've done in my presentation, I've given you all my tools, all the guidelines, the work plan, etc., is part of how we build trust, but also how we can be checked ourselves, you know, and be improved, you know, receive feedback and things like that. And so once you've done that, you go and they go over, okay, we looked at the API provided by Twitter and the user in their homes, in the different parts of thingamies, all the time reminding people basic wording, you know. If people start knowing the word recommend, rank, generate, API, etc., we are building a knowledge base. You know, these words are no longer just in the small community of people who are developing them, etc. And so I let you browse and look at this, and you'll see why, how you can use it in your own practice, and how you can use these examples in your own practice. And I'm going to stop here for sharing, just inviting you to go there, talk with us, talk with the Check First community, etc. It's now expanding. It's gotten help from Mozilla Foundation and expanding to another 10 French-speaking countries. This Check First, the dashboard. There are other dashboards, and I think learning to navigate dashboards for us users is going to become very important because we don't want to be the fact checkers, we don't want to be the developers, but we want to be able to share in their results and see how we use these results for us in our practices. And I think that's the negotiation at the moment, where everybody stays in their mission and their expertise, but comes together. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks very much, Divina. That is an important point, I believe. I see a hand up there from Miko. Do you want to take the floor, please?
Thank you. And first of all, my excuses. I joined the meeting from the beginning, but then I had an important call that I couldn't resist, so I haven't listened to you, unfortunately, but I'm not trying to catch up. But when Divina, that we have worked a long time together, and also Stefan asked about fact-checking and what Divina is talking, I can send you afterward the link to what we've been working with the Faktabari and the Nordis project on digital information literacy, and we touch the same tools, and also thanks to Divina, we are actually now trying to get a common project with the Check First that Divina mentioned, to somehow replicate the ideas that has been done with a crossover project in Finland and learned from that one. So very curious on that one, and my excuses of not being able to see, but I see that we are recorded, so I will get back to that later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, I'll send you for the fact checkers community for the project we worked with EU Disinfo Lab, and which is very good and doing a lot of excellent work. And it's part of the European Fact Checkers Network, which is also part of the international Fact Checkers Network. And so I think fact checkers are coming to it from a different perspective. We've also worked with AFP and AFP Factuel and with the tool INVID. But what's interesting for us from the perspective of a user and the EMIL community is that there are now some tools that are not just for professionals. The challenge for us is to turn these professional tools in less professional tools, or tools for other professionals. And the feedback we receive, at least from the teaching community, is we don't have the time. We are not journalists and we are not fact checkers. Give us ready-made, give us toolkits. And then from there, from these examples, etc., we will introduce them in our practice. We will add them on. But it is very hard for them. And Andy, I think, who's been assisting us in trying to introduce the toolkit in the classrooms, knows how complicated it is for teachers to add to their load already of different media literacy projects and news literacy projects, to add yet another approach. And algo literacy creates a fear, I think, for the moment. It's still, there's this, this is so complicated. This is the black box. And this is where media literacy, critical media literacy, is important. The black box is a myth, sorry. It's something that the companies want us to believe because they want to keep them as secret commercial tools. Fine. So how do we debunk that, and how do we nonetheless control our uses and practices? That's our point.
Thanks very much for that, Divina. It's most helpful. I see a question in chat. I've lost Maria. Oh, here you are.
I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I've been having problems with my mic. Yes, there's a question just while we still have Divina, just a quick question about whether there's an intention to include other languages, and then I have a follow-up question for you as well, if I can. You are muted, Divina.
Well, definitely for us and for Check First and all that, yes, other languages. All our resources are in open educational resources. You can take them, translate them, use DeepL, works very well. Translate, use, localize, go for it.
It's an interesting point, that, because, you know, the linguistic diversity in Europe means that there is a tendency, or there's a risk rather than a tendency, to either duplicate effort in terms of resources that are essentially useful for everybody. So I think it is important that asking the linguistic question is really, really important, because the more we share those resources, the more we translate them into languages where we need them to be, the stronger those resources are. And I think that that's something that we definitely need to reflect on in an ongoing way. Any other questions? I see some comments here from our EDMO colleagues. Yes, I think the EDMO hub in Ireland will definitely be looking at that very closely.
So can I just come back on one final question for Divina, although obviously anyone else, please do also join in. And this sort of related partly to what Ricardo has just said. It seems to me that the kind of the use of the dashboard and of the materials that you're collecting in this project, that there are many different types of people, actors, professions that can actually find this useful. Is it intended for any particular kind of constituency, Divina, or is it really just that anyone can take advantage of the materials and the work that you've done for whatever purposes they want?
The point, and especially with Check First was to provide a tool that answered journalists' needs, including the needs of journalists in EMIL.
Yep.
I repeat, the needs of journalists in media literacy, because it's not because they are journalists that they're media literate. I'm sorry, I don't want to insult anybody when I say that, but the processes of that we have in media literacy are not exactly the same, of course, as the way journalists do search and inquiry and storytelling. And so there has to be a discussion with those two communities of educators and journalists and developers. We try to make tools that are as simple, the 10 key points and things like that, to make sure that the general public feels, okay, it's doable. I can address this one, or I can address this one. Because what's scary, and Ansgar showed it very well about the explainability, is how complex, in fact, if you start explaining it, and then you start losing everybody, including the journalists. So our problem has been to break it down, and you saw us breaking down the domains of competences in micro competences and the key points in to make it palatable for a larger public. The interactive quizzes are actually what seems to be working best, because people can test it for themselves. They don't have a feeling they're being watched and being punished or whatever. They can see what they know, what they don't know. So we are planning in the future to develop more interactive quizzes, more game-based interactive quizzes, more do-it-yourself interactive quizzes, so that people feel more and more that they have a hands-on approach. While at the same time doing what Ansgar and Max have been doing, you still have to produce for teachers and for experts, for practitioners. They have to have a feeling they know more than their constituencies, so that they can ask questions, but also that they have they can speak with trust and a sense of competence, which is where training comes in, and it takes time to train. And that's what at the moment is really missing in all professions, I think, unfortunately, because it's normal. It's an upskilling, it's a continuous training kind of approach. And so not everybody has the time right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I just wanted to that's really helpful to clarify, I think, for me as well, because this point that you make about that we need to provide the tools for the professionals who then need to pass them on to their constituencies, that it's a cascade of knowledge and of competence that you're creating here, which I think is a really helpful explanation. Thank you. There's a couple more questions but also a comment from Ansgar in the chat. Stephanie, I don't know if perhaps should we go back to Ansgar for to perhaps just to elaborate on that. And I think it's partly actually linked to Faye's comment about how smart are these systems? How much smarter do we need to be than them? And what's the reality here?
Ansgar, can we bring you back on to this? I think you made a very interesting point there.
Sure, happy to do that. Really just picking up on the point that Divina was making around the black box being a narrative that is being pushed, and that this is also just part of the marketing around the systems, but it's very much part of the marketing around positioning these systems like they're magic. They can do all kinds of things. They can do things that we couldn't even even the creators of the system can't explain how it did this. So maybe it can do all kinds of other things. And now we can start speculating about all types of things it could do. And it's especially this kind of narrative of tool X could do something is what we've seen. And it's not just around AI, it's been around blockchain, it's been around all kinds of other things as well, where you never mention that in order for it to do that other thing, all kinds of other preconditions would have to be in place. You would have to have the right kinds of data sets. You would have to have perhaps lots more access and maybe energy consumption and other things that don't get mentioned in the narrative around it could do something. Often the it could do this actually implies it could do this if we can solve all kinds of other problems that we currently have an idea how to solve. It's just part of the marketing really around saying my tool is the next thing that everybody needs to have.
Yeah, thanks, Ansgar. Max, I'm just wondering if you have any views or comments on this particular element of the discussion. I would love to bring you in here.
No, I think Ansgar's point is very valid, and we've seen this indeed a lot in the recent technology hypes, that a lot of it is just marketing. I think I would want to push back a little bit on the extent to which this is a black box or not. I mean, of course, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of marketing. As far as I can tell at the moment, there is also a lot of intransparency still, and it is sometimes quite difficult to actually put a finger on and say this is the impacts on this specific community. I think there also it's going to be quite important to see, okay, to whom is this system transparent? Are we able to evaluate the impact also in the different communities in Europe? So, for example, what is its impact if it's deployed with regards to all of the different languages in Europe? That I think also in the platform context is a big challenge. And then the question also who actually is able to scrutinize these systems. Media companies themselves, I think, have a lot of role to play there, but especially when we talk about long-term research, that takes a lot of it takes a lot of resources. Simply, it takes a lot of expertise, a lot of resources, and not every organization has the resources to be able to carry that out.
Thanks for that, Max. I do think that brings us into this this question, which has been at the core of a lot of the media literacy discourse for decades, really, about individual responsibility and what people should be doing to protect themselves, make themselves aware, make themselves learn, grow their knowledge, their understanding, etc. Feyland here is a very good question about the responsibility. I can't say the word, I won't say it. Responsibility, and how, you know, responsibility can be placed on people who should not be asked to carry that responsibility. And here we're talking about, you know, either from a psychological or from a vulnerability perspective. Any of our panel wanting to comment on that? How, you know, how we minimize those risks and how we ensure that actually vulnerable people, young women, are not young women, young everybody, older people, less data aware people are not necessarily asked to be responsible for what they are fed through on social media channels. Any views on that? Any of you?
I'll start, and then Ansgar and Max can
yeah, thank you, Divina.
I think one of the important things when you start, you know, building awareness before you start building resilience and resistance. If you remember my my model for change, awareness and knowledge are important. You still have to break it down in ways that are understandable for people, but I think in the explainability part, showing that AI and algorithms are in fact relying on huge databases that have been made available over time is very important, because it explains biases in the algorithms, and especially gender biases. And when you go back to data that have been piled up for the last 100 years by men, you should not be surprised that the results are gender biased against women and young women, etc. And so once you start knowing that, you can build examples, videos that show how this happens, etc., etc. The absence of women inventors and women researchers in the field of computation, etc., etc. All these things, yeah, because if the algorithms are fed our knowledge, including our fakes, and so this is when you start saying, oh, hang on, I have to watch out. I have to be an algo watcher.
Ansgar, can I bring you on to that as well? You talked about language here, which I think is an important dimension.
Sure. So there is actually also a small, hopefully growing community amongst journalists who have already also picked up on this and saying that, at least in part, it's also a responsibility for journalists to take on to avoid the use of language that implies certain capabilities. But it is also something which is being discussed in the responsible AI community, though it is struggling to gain traction. And so what is the key problem here with the language? Even starting with something like, obviously, artificial intelligence or machine learning, by using words that are directly linked to the way in which we as humans engage with things, we are driving people to interpret these state systems as if they have more capabilities that are human-like. So if we say machine learning, we all have from our own experience, a sense of what does learning mean? Well, learning means acquiring information, but it also means integrating that information into our life experience. That it means gaining a deeper understanding of what it means in relation to all kinds of things. That is not what the machines are doing. The machines are identifying statistical patterns. But because we've told people it's machine learning, people assume that it actually has an understanding of the context of that data and those kinds of things. And therefore, they will project that kind of an assumption on the outputs that they receive and not know when to be critical about actually using those outputs. And that's just one of the many words. The AI has a terrible tendency to always jump for an anthropomorphic word wherever possible to try to explain something. That is really something that we need to be pushing against and moving away from. I think it was a team in New York that of journalists that are really saying, part of this is just to be more specific in explaining what it is that the system is doing when you're describing it in your journalistic articles about something. Don't just use these kinds of broad terms, but it has to be something. The responsibility has to lie on both sides, not just the people who are reporting about it in the media. It has to also be a responsibility of those who are creating these systems and putting them out. The problem, of course, is that certainly for a lot of the business community, they want to be hyping up the capabilities, and so pushing them to move away from that kind of language is very difficult. But certainly, if we can at least get the academic space and the journalist space to move in this direction, we would already be gaining quite a bit.
Thanks, Ansgar. Max, I'm going to bring you in on to maybe answer that as well. I just find it fascinating that responsibility, which I think for many, many years has been pushed, especially by platforms really, onto the individual. quite squarely centering elsewhere now. And, you know, as a community of regulators, they are questions we need to ask ourselves as well, in terms of what does that mean for our own work and our own, you know, constituencies. Max, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very important point, and thank you for raising it, Faye. I think most of the points raised by Ansgar, by Divina, very important, fully agree with them. What I'd add is that there's a tendency in the legal field, where I come from, in the media fields, that sometimes it's seen as an either or. We can either have individual responsibility or we can have responsibility for media companies. That is a false dichotomy, I think. So there's a tendency in the legal community to think, okay, we've seen user responsibility now so often being used to escape responsibility on behalf of companies, of organizations actually using AI, so give up on individual responsibility. That I think would throw out the baby with the bathwater. There is, especially in the context of the media, quite a lot of role for empowering users. Of course, framing that in terms of responsibility is, I think, not particularly useful. What you see also in the context of the media is that they themselves actually are struggling with how are we using these tools responsibly. And then again, there is a very quick move to saying, okay, at least we're going to be transparent about the ways in which we use them. And that is just woefully insufficient. Simply disclosing we're using an AI system, and even going a bit further, this is the functioning of the AI system. Very good. It doesn't do anything at all to actually assuage the responsibility of the impact of editorial values.
Thanks so much, Max. Fascinating. I could go on for days with you all here. Any questions to our incredible panel? I'm absolutely bowled over today. There's so much food for thought for all of us. Any other areas where you want to take the discussion, or indeed dive deeper into the themes that we've explored so far? Divina, please.
While the questions have come in people's minds, I think as regulators that you are and participating in some of the work of ARCOM, myself, what's been very useful is auditing. Auditing the platforms. We've audited them in France, for instance, on what they did during the elections in the US, what they did during COVID. And each time we ask the question, and what are you doing with media literacy and things like that? And so I think auditing the platforms on their algorithms and their ethical use of the algorithms could be something that you could undertake. It would be interesting because it's not something that is the responsibility of the user. And the user, frankly, doesn't want to know what's in the algorithm. He just wants, he or she wants results, and he wants to know that he can trust those results, and should he change browsing behavior or whatever. And so, but knowing that there is a relatively independent authority there that is watching and is making accountable seems to me important. And my experience with ARCOM over the 3 years where we've been doing these audits is that the platforms have been listening. And they have been coming up with, this is what we do, and this is what we're planning, and this is what worked, and this is who we employ, and etc. One of the examples to follow there is how moderation has sort of progressed in this field over the last 10 years. And so I would say that having a role of auditor of the algorithms would be one of your roles. And that way you don't have to disclose the actual black box, who cares, but you can disclose the outputs. And this is what Ansgar was saying, what we're interested as people in our everyday lives is a trust in the outputs, damn it.
Yeah, thanks, Divina. That's a really, really strong point. Leo, I see your hand up. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to all of the presenters. I just kind of I would like Max to clarify a little bit, maybe some of the last points that I'm not quite sure I captured. Maybe I was thinking about something else while you were saying it, but about the responsibility of the editors and then about the the trust that like explaining how the AI is being used or has been used in journalism, that you said something about that could you like, does more like, if the journal if the editors or the journals provide more explanations how they use AI, does it actually increase the trust towards media, or does it actually have some other effect? Maybe other presenters can also comment on this, because I think this can be quite kind of a crucial question towards in terms of media literacy education, that we tend to think that if we make the processes more transparent, that should be a good thing, but can it actually be just the opposite?
Thank you for your question. Sometimes I think actually as a preceding point, it being the opposite is not necessarily a problem if AI is indeed trustworthy. Then from a legal perspective, we should want explanations to decrease trust. Maybe also let me say, I am a legal scholar and it's an empirical question. So let me be mindful of my own limitations. The impression I get from the literature is that risk perceptions do affect trust, or are correlated with trust, at least when it comes to specific explanations and their impact on trust. There, the effect sizes in general seem either not to exist or to be quite small. And there might be a lot of different reasons for that. In part, it might simply be that trust is a somewhat stable concept, and that simply providing an explanation is not enough to meaningfully move the needle when it comes to trust. But then that over time, such explanations, such transparency might still be able to increase trust. But I'd also be very interested in hearing from the other speakers on this.
So I think one of the crucial question is whether or not this push towards transparency is applied across all platforms. You need a level playing field, because what transparency really does is it helps people to calibrate the level of trust that they put into the platform to an appropriate level. If you have some platforms that are going to be transparent and others that are not, then the transparent ones, they reveal where do they have weaknesses and where might the output be less trustworthy. And the not transparent ones can claim to be more reliable than they really are. So what you need is that there is a level playing field on the level of transparency that is being demanded from all parties.
I think that makes sense. Divina, do you want to come back on it? I see your comment there. Do you want to? We're going to have to close the discussion, I'm very sorry to say. But do you want to come back on this?
Well, yes, the transparency thing, again, going back to my experience with ARCOM, after 3 years of the platforms, all of them, the 20 or so that matter, the structuring ones, says the DSA, providing reports, and these reports being available on the website of ARCOM, we've seen them changing. They look at each other because they're in competition. And so I think in commercial terms, the level playing field that Ansgar is calling for can happen this way. You know, you put them out there with their reports and everybody looks. And oh, here they're not being transparent, here they're not being clear, here they're only doing PR and this is bullshit, etc. This gets circulated. And these platforms are very reactive to that. So we have to play on that as long as we are acting commercially with them. That's what we have to play upon. So, and my other last point was about the imaginaries, because I was going back to Swartz's definition of algorithmic literacy, where she emphasizes and taking into account the imaginaries, and I think the black box is part of the imaginary. And so again, this clarifying the language, the not anthropomorphizing the language, etc., is something we have to be very careful about. And when we do it, we should exploit it because it can be fun. You know, Frankenstein, hey, go for it.
Thank you very much. And on that final literary note, if I might add, I think we are going to, unfortunately, bring the discussion to a close. I'd like to hand over. I can't thank you enough. It was so interesting and so stimulating to see the three of you just interacting in that way and the complementary of information. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it to Maria, who has the unenviable task of summing up the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. My huge thanks to the speakers and to Stephanie for obviously for organising the discussion so expertly. I'm going to just draw on a couple of themes that I think came across as common through the discussion and through the various experts that we've heard from. I'll be very brief. We will of course provide a written summary of today's session for you to then go away and think about, and we will I believe be able to share the presentation so that you can also reflect and think about how the tools and some of the ideas that were discussed here today can be useful to you in your daily work. And that I think extends to everyone who's here today. And I should just want to make the point that we've been really lucky today to have not only EPRA members and the members of the EMIL task force, which is broader than regulators, but also several, I see experts from the EDMO community, the EDMO media literacy community, which Sally is bringing together. And I think we're really, today's session for me really demonstrates just how strong this community is between the different actors and the different networks that have sprung up. And I think more of this type of common discussions between EPRA and EDMO and the participants of each of those networks is definitely the way I think we would like to develop this community. I think it's been really, really brilliant to see so many of you here that I didn't know from EMIL, and that I do know from other contexts. So thanks so much for joining today. Just a couple of key themes. I think one of the things that really stood out for me was the way in which these types of tools are so predominantly used by journalists and in the journalistic process. I think that really, and I have to say this is my old-fashioned approach, but when I did my journalism training, it was so long ago, and obviously the practices involved were around telephoning and going to see the press cuttings and so on and so forth, and those sorts of things are dead now, and it's really all about how to use the internet and the automated tools for good or for bad. And so that was really fascinating to see, and therefore the importance of training journalists and ensuring that the media has a different type of approach to questions of explainability and has a different insight into those issues. I think there was some really nice parallels between some of the tools actually and some of the frameworks for explainability. So the 10 points that Divina showed and the different types of explanation that Ansgar talked about. Be interesting to put those next to each other actually and have a look at how they interact. But I think I saw quite a lot of common aspects to that in the brief view we had of them. That's certainly something I'll go away and think about. I think also there was a real link between the kind of the need to focus on the reaction point, the react point that Divina talked about, and the purpose of explainability that Ansgar outlined. I think that really do hone in on exactly that. It's like, why do we need to explain it? And from Ansgar's presentation, I got that we need to understand these systems in order to be able to challenge them. And then similarly from Divina's, the words used were resistance and resilience. But again, it's that whole kind of common concept of asking questions, challenging, being able to push back, being able to take responsibility, and so on, and different levels of what that means for the media and what that means for the public. So I think that was a common theme as well. And then of course there was much discussion about trust and about what kind of levels of explainability, by whom, for whom, how they impact on trust. I thought Max's studies that demonstrated the kind of the difference between what people perceive they want for trust and what impact that has was sobering. But something we really need to focus on as a media literacy community, media and information literacy community, because if what we are trying to do is to create a situation where systems are understood properly, trusted appropriately, and that people have the tools and the skills in order to be able to to distinguish between trustworthy information and not. We have to understand what doesn't work, and so we have to be able to be honest about that. So that, I think, is probably where I'll stop. Obviously a huge amount of useful material there for all of us to continue to use as well. So a huge thanks to all of you for taking the time to present your work. Thank you. Oh, actually, one more thing I just wanted to trail, which is that Natalie Hellberger, whose name was mentioned earlier, and Richard Fletcher are working with a number of us in the Council of Europe on a set of guidelines for the ethical use of AI in journalism, and that those are at quite an advanced stage, and hopefully will be in the public domain, I think, this summer. We will certainly share those with all of you. There's a huge amount in those recommendations which was covered today. So Max, no doubt, will be familiar with that work, but hopefully also something that will really contribute to this discussion as well. So thank you.
Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to ask our panelists, I know Ansgar has already kindly shared his presentation, but Divina and Max, are you happy to share yours with our members? I think there was a request about that. It's really useful documentation to be able to go back to and investigate further. So thank you very much for that. We normally have a short kind of update. I'm running out of time as usual. If I share something, it goes over time, so you're just gonna have to get used to that. But if has anybody got any update or events or anything they want to put on our radar? Maria did flag that Council of Europe work, and we look forward to that, and I'm sure we'll share it in due course. But anybody else in either the field of AI or EMIL or both want to share some upcoming task, events, documents, anything?
Could I
Yes.
jump in, Stephanie, very quickly?
Yes.
I'm very sorry. I tried to raise my hand, but I think I just managed to put a thumb up, and I'm not really sure what that means. So yeah, as you said, just very briefly to share, some of you may already have seen in late March, the UK government published its UK AI white paper, which I'm just going to pop a link there into the chat, and it's a non-statutory principles-based approach. So kind of like significantly diverging from what we've seen with the EU AI Act, but looking more similar to perhaps the US blueprint AI Bill of Rights, etc. So if for anyone perhaps who hasn't seen that, just to flag that there.
Thanks so much, Connor. Very helpful. Always helpful to have a sense of those governmental directions in these fields. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. So I think might exceptionally beyond. Oh, sorry, Faye, I didn't see your hand. Here it is.
Sorry, Stephanie, I'm struggling to find my hand, which is clearly a problem. I think since the last EMIL meeting, the Ofcom media literacy research, which comes out on an annual basis, has been published. So I'll pop the link to that in the chat in case that's interesting to anyone.
Thank you very much. That's always very interesting. And Sally, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, it took me a moment to find my hand as well too. Just two very quick things. We have in our newsletter going out, our media learning newsletter going out next week. We have two really nice articles on media literacy in Australia, which is a nice overview of the government initiatives in Australia, and the same thing from Sweden, from the Swedish Media Council. So just to kind of flag those two articles next week as good overviews of things happening in particular regions and countries. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks. And Miko, I see the link to the Nordic expert group on digital democracy, which I've been following for a while as well. So thanks very much for that. I'll give a very brief update from an Irish perspective. The Department of Media here has set up a national counter disinformation strategy working group that gathers government departments, but also civil society, regulators, and media literacy organizations. And I for my sins sit on it. We don't have something very tangible to report on yet, but I expect there will be a strategy before the end of the year, and I would be very happy to share it with all of you at that stage. Obviously, we want to ensure that it is aligned to the European work in that space as well. So it's something that we might liaise on at some other stage. Anything else? Anybody else? Okay, so I'm going to bring the meeting to a close. I'm going to say from an AI roundtable perspective, we're always looking for topics and speakers and interventions. So if there is anything you wish to share or contribute or ideas you have for further sessions, please send them to Geraldine or Emmanuel or myself, or the three of us. And we always try to ensure that we make the the topics relevant to our members. Maria, I see your hand up. I was actually going to hand you the floor as well to close, maybe from a EMIL perspective. Thank you.
You, as always, you read my mind, but I thought, given everyone's problems with raising their hand, I'd get in there first. Yes, exactly. So I just wanted to say our thank you very much to everyone from the EMIL task force membership who has attended. I wanted to nag you again about filling out your member profile if you have not yet done that, and I will. This time, I promise, I will be coming for you personally. If you haven't done it, so our next scheduled meeting will be sometime, I think, in July. We will come back to you with a concrete date on that. I think so. In terms of thematics and so on, I think we thought perhaps it was time for us to meet again, maybe without a concrete topic to discuss, and just to have a chance to share updates and see how everybody's doing and what's happening, having had some very, very full sessions over the last couple of meetings that we've had. But one thing I think we could, in that context, focus on is a discussion that I've been having with Patrick about reflecting on your experiences, if appropriate, of reporting on media literacy activities at the national level for the purposes of the European Commission. I think it might be helpful for everyone to hear from some experiences and indeed to discuss how we feel that reporting and the data collected through that reporting could usefully be used. So we'll come back to you with a more concrete suggestion on that. But if anyone has any particular thoughts on that in advance, please don't hesitate to contact me or Emmanuel or Geraldine, and we will incorporate your ideas into our next session. Thanks again. Thanks so much to Stephanie as well.
And finally, thank you to our three speakers, Divina, Frau-Meigs, Ansgar, Koene, and Max van Drunen. Thank you so much for your insightful and stimulating debates here today. We're very grateful for your time and your engagement with our network. Thank you. You're on time to go back to work now. Take care and see you.